What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today,
it's Saturday. You know what time it is. Time to get into the wide receiver starts and sits heading into week 6. As per usual, we'll be going through each and every matchup, letting you know overall how we feel about the wide receivers in those games, touch a bit about their floor and their ceiling, letting you know overall around the range in which we have them ranked. So by the end of this video, you'll have a good understanding of which player we would start over the other. Of course, with it being Saturday, the rankings we currently have aren't going to be the exact rankings we have on Sunday. For the exact rankings and to know exactly which player we would start over the other, we definitely recommend checking out our rankings. Those can be found at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. As mentioned, with us 6 weeks in, the injuries are starting to stack up and really impact many of our teams. Couple that with the bye weeks we're currently facing, and it's not going to be as easy as it was to choose which players to start and sit this week. So being sure we're making the correct decisions is going to be as important now than ever. We have a ton of matchups to go over though, so we'll hop right into the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running back in week 4 scored the most half PPR fantasy points without scoring a touchdown. The correct answer was actually Chuba Hubbard. Congratulations to Mitch Zabka, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, at Connor Tinkle. Once again, congratulations to both of you, but as for today's stat of the day, which quarterback among qualified starters currently boasts the league's worst completion rate, despite having the third most time to throw in the league? Once again, that's which quarterback currently boasts the league's worst completion rate at the position, despite having the third most time to throw. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado though, let's hop right into the first matchup we have, which is going to be the Miami Dolphins on the road against the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jacksonville Jaguars will be the home team in this matchup. Keep in mind though that this is a London game, so it won't be the prototypical home field advantage that the Jacksonville Jaguars would have if they were in Florida. But if there were a team that would be the favorite out in London, the Jacksonville Jaguars certainly would be that team. So if any team were to have home field advantage on the road in London, it definitely would be Jacksonville. Starting with the Jags, we have two wide receivers that we're potentially considering starting. Both of them do present a certain level of risk, but this game does come in with a pretty high total with 47 points. With Jacksonville only being 3-point underdogs in this one, it not only will have a positive passing game script for them theoretically, but a 3-point spread is still on the small side for Jacksonville, so their projected team total is relatively high when compared to the overall game total of 47 points. That's a roundabout way of saying that this team is going to be putting up points, so the chances of success for wide receivers in this matchup, mainly Laviska and Marvin Jones, it's going to be pretty high, even in what should be looked at as a poor matchup against the Miami Dolphins. Currently on the season, the Miami Dolphins allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position, so don't get me wrong, I understand not trusting them in your lineup if you have better options, but most of us with the buys and the injuries, we're not going to have that luxury. Due to the poor matchup though, and the fact that both of them busted in a positive matchup last week, we did drop them pretty significantly in the rankings. Even with DJ Chark out of the lineup, neither one of them does have the feeling of a safe wide receiver. If we had to choose one though, Marvin Jones clearly would be the option that we would choose, but we do have him ranked outside the top 36, meaning we can only trust him as a flex this week. As for Laviska, he's ranked significantly lower, nearly 12 spots lower to be specific, still inside the top 50. But that's not saying much considering we do have teams on bye, several players injured, so if you do have a better option and a better matchup, we would definitely suggest starting that player over Laviska, and Marvin Jones you're still playing with fire as well. On the other side of the ball, the only real wide receiver we're considering starting is Jalen Waddle. The big news in this one on the Miami side is that Tua is looking to make his first game back. With that does come a bit more upside when compared to what they had with Jacoby Brissett, but with it being his first game back, him already being a questionable talent when it comes to receiving upside or supporting fantasy wide receivers, trusting Jalen Waddle as anything more than wide receiver 3 is definitely going to be a risky endeavor as well. So basically all wide receivers in this matchup, they're going to be a bit risky and likely you should be avoiding them. To Waddle's credit though, we are very high on him for the rest of season rankings. He was featured as one of our players to target in our wide receiver trade targets video we just uploaded a couple days ago. If you haven't seen that, check it out. And although I do seem like I'm bagging on Jalen Waddle a bit, it's mostly to do with Tua coming back and it being his first game back. Overall, this matchup against Jacksonville, it's one of the better matchups we could possibly ask for, so there is a high opportunity for him to succeed. Devontae Parker injured, not going to play. Will Fuller also on IR. And for those of you wondering if you can start Preston Williams with those two players out, we still would suggest to leave him on the bench. As mentioned, if we think Jalen Waddle's risky, a player that only needs one play in order to pay off the start, Preston Williams, the more possession wide receiver, one that does require a bit more volume, his risk is going to be virtually tenfold, so we suggest leaving him on the bench. Moving into the next matchup though, we have a very interesting one with the LA Chargers on the road against the Baltimore Ravens. The Baltimore Ravens and Marquise Brown at the wide receiver position have been proving very fruitful for fantasy. Marquise Brown has now scored a receiving touchdown in all games but one. The one game that he didn't score a receiving touchdown, he literally dropped two. And despite how good he's been playing through the first 4 games of this season, he's actually coming off of his best game of the year. That does have to be taken a bit with a grain of salt though. That was against the Indianapolis Colts, one of the weakest pass defenses at defending opposing wide receivers. This matchup against the LA Chargers is likely going to be the hardest they've faced all season. For that though, Marquise Brown does drop a bit in the rankings, his wide receiver 1 production. Our expectations for him this week is going to be more in that wide receiver 2 range, with him being a player that does have a high ceiling but a bit of a low floor at times. We do have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 2, but we can't be surprised if he does post wide receiver 1 production. He's been doing it all season, so if you own him, put him in the lineup. A bad matchup is not going to scare me away from starting a stud, and that's exactly what Marquise Brown has been all season. The other big news is that Sammy Watkins in this matchup, he's injured, unlikely to play. As it stood, he was already a risky player to start in a full PPR league, not even a player scoring touchdowns either, so there's really no other player on this team that I'm interested in starting at the wide receiver position outside of Marquise Brown. On the other side of the ball for the LA Chargers, one thing I want to tell you is that facing Baltimore is not as scary as meets the eye. While they have been a scary defense in the past few seasons, as for this season, they really haven't been performing as well. It's one reason that's why this passing offense has needed to perform so well so far this season. So when it comes to players like Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, as we know they're auto starts, but just to set your expectations, their upside in this matchup is going to be just as high as it would be in nearly any other matchup. I'm almost to the point where I would consider them both virtually matchup proof. Justin Herbert's playing absolutely out of his mind, and Keenan Allen owners do have to be a bit disappointed at the production they've seen out of Mike Williams, definitely taking away some of the upside from him. It's come to a point now where we actually do have Mike Williams ranked higher than Keenan Allen, and it likely will remain that way from this point on. As you can see, we have Mike Williams ranked this week as a wide receiver 1, Keenan Allen a wide receiver 2, but don't get it mistaken. Mike Williams, he is ranked as a back-end wide receiver 1, Keenan Allen a high-end wide receiver 2, so despite them seeming like they're 12 players apart, they're actually only a few players apart, so start them both with confidence. With this game having a high total of 51 points, I wouldn't be surprised to see this game shoot out, so the upside for Marquise Brown, Keenan Allen, and Mike Williams, it can match if not compete with any wide receiver this week. Moving into the next matchup though, we have the Minnesota Vikings against the Carolina Panthers. Carolina in this one, they are going to be the home team. It does have a modest total of 45.5 points. Panthers, although the home team, they are going to be 2.5 point home underdogs. With that said though, one thing to keep in mind is that both of these quarterbacks have been trending down in their recent matchups. Kirk Cousins coming off of 2 mediocre performances, Sam Darnold coming off of his worst performance of the season. But even with that, on the Carolina side, DJ Moore, he's an auto start. The Minnesota Vikings have allowed the 11th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. They've also allowed 7 receiving touchdowns as well, which is definitely on the higher end. So long story short, I wouldn't be surprised if DJ Moore, a player that's already producing at an extremely high level, I wouldn't be surprised if he scores a receiving touchdown or possibly 2 in this game. And as for Robbie Anderson, a player that we really haven't been able to trust recently, I think with the bye weeks right now, as well as the injuries that are stacking up, this is the perfect time to have such a positive matchup. Believe it or not, this is actually one we could potentially trust Robbie Anderson in. Trust may not be the right terminology because I know that his bust rate's still going to remain relatively high even in a positive matchup. Simply put, the targets aren't there, but if he is to receive the targets, I'm confident that he can produce against this defense. The only question is whether or not he will receive those targets. If there were a matchup for him to succeed in though, this would definitely be the team to do it against. With that said though, we do still have him ranked in the mid 40s though, so you likely do have a better option, but some of you desperate owners out there that may have found Robbie Anderson off the waiver wire, you could certainly do worse than starting him this week week against Minnesota, but behind Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore, there's no other wide receiver for Carolina we're interested in starting, even in this positive matchup. On the other side of the ball, though, the matchup's not so great for the Minnesota wide receivers. I would even go as far as to compare these two teams as polar opposites. Just as weak as Minnesota is at guarding wide receivers, Carolina is just as strong at defending them. And as mentioned, with Kirk Cousins coming off of 2 mediocre outings, mainly that's impacted the upside and floor of Adam Thielen over Justin Jefferson. So Justin Jefferson, he will still retain his high ranking of a wide receiver 1, but as for Adam Thielen, we did have to drop him. Currently, we have him ranked as the wide receiver 28, so just inside the top 30. A far cry away from his back-end wide receiver 1 rankings. We had him just 3 or 4 weeks ago. His high-end wide receiver 2 rankings just a couple weeks ago. But with him being a player that virtually needs a touchdown to score, and after playing on 93% of the snaps, he only received 3 targets in a game against Detroit, an equally bad team at defending opposing wide receivers. Adam Thielen has now put up a combined 13.6 PPR fantasy points in his last 2 contests. And so far this season, the Carolina Panthers have only allowed 5 receiving touchdowns through 5 weeks, so the chances of him scoring are going to be a bit unlikely. But if anyone can get it done, it's Adam Thielen, who definitely has a nose for the end zone. The next matchup we have is the Chicago Bears at home against the Green Bay Packers, a divisional matchup that has an extremely low total when talking about the Packers. It's only coming in at 44 points. In this one, the Packers will be 5.5 point road favorites. Not much really needs to be said in this game, as we know with Justin Fields starting, and he is projected to be the starter currently. The overall upside of this passing offense and the upside of the fantasy wide receivers in this offense, mainly Darnell Mooney, Allen Robinson, they're going to be limited. If it were up to the Chicago Bears, while Justin Fields is still developing, they would like to run as much as possible. Unfortunately for them, though, they've lost David Montgomery. Now Damian Williams is injured too, paving the way for Herbert to be starting, a player who received 18 touches on the ground. And when you combine that type of rushing production with the rushing production we got out of Damian Williams, it's safe to say that if this team could run the ball on every play, they definitely would. So it's going to be a risky start, as we already know, with both A-Rob as well as Darnell Mooney. Call is foolish, but we still do have Allen Robinson just slightly edging out Darnell Mooney, meaning if I did own both players, which would be highly unlikely to begin with, but if I did theoretically, if I had to choose one, I'm starting A-Rob. I know Mooney has been the player that's been receiving the most targets in the past 2 matchups, but when it comes to snaps, which player's on the field the most, believe it or not, this is an area that he actually edges Darnell Mooney out in, so we're going to stick with the upside of Allen Robinson, but his availability for week 6 is still up in the air. I will say that if Allen Robinson does sit, Darnell Mooney will shoot up the rankings, but as it stands right now, both players we do have ranked just inside the top 40, so nothing to write home about. If it were up to us, we'd likely try to opt for a higher upside option. But with this matchup being against the Green Bay Packers and this team short of running backs, they may be forced to throw the ball a bit more than they would like. That could easily benefit the receivers in this offense, so it's not to say there isn't any upside. On the other side of the ball, nothing really needs to be said. We're starting Devontae Adams. We have him ranked as the number 1 overall wide receiver this week, and the only other wide receiver we would consider starting would be Randall Cobb, a player who has shown flashes but really hasn't shown the consistency. Of course, he's always a potential player who could pop off. We've seen it before, and in this matchup against the Chicago Bears, which quietly actually has been a defense that has been giving it up to the wide receiver position, this certainly could be a game where Randall Cobb has one of his vintage performances. Regardless, though, the most likely outcome for him is going to be 2 receptions for 40 yards, so preferably I'd start a different player over Cobb, but with many teams being desperate at this point in the season, I could understand picking him up off the waivers, potentially putting him in the lineup in a sneaky high upside matchup. The most likely outcome is a failure, but at this point in the season, not all of us have better options. The next matchup we have is actually a pretty interesting one despite not looking like one on paper. It's the Cincinnati Bengals on the road against the Detroit Lions. There are a lot of similarities between both of these teams. 2 teams that are getting pretty solid production out of the quarterback position. 2 offenses that have been competing with the opposing offenses so far this season, so I wouldn't be surprised to see these teams neck and neck despite Cincinnati being a 3.5 point road favorite. In this one, though, it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, but the overall projected total is 46.5 points. That's because similarly with both of these teams, their defense when it comes to the passing game is extremely weak. With both of these teams having quarterbacks that can definitely defeat the opposing defenses, I wouldn't be surprised to see this actually hit the over. So the 2 healthy wide receivers on the Detroit Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Khalif Raymond, both of them can be started in the flex position. I would say that Khalif Raymond, a player that's been a bit more hit or miss than Amon-Ra St. Brown being a higher floor player. I would consider Raymond more of a desperation play this week, but as we all know, the Detroit wide receivers have been falling each and every week. None of them can stay healthy, so the opportunity for each of these two receivers, it's been increasing with each and every week. I wouldn't be surprised in this matchup for both of them to exceed expectations, but don't hold me to that. It's definitely within their range of outcomes, but as mentioned, don't trust him as more than a flex. And on the other side of the ball for Cincinnati, Ja'Marr Chase, a player that's been absolutely phenomenal this season, a touchdown scoring machine. He's going to be ranked as a wide receiver 1 this week. Believe it or not, this is actually the first week that we have him ranked as a wide receiver 1. That's a trend that will likely continue after a good performance against this weak passing defense, but that's not to say that both T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd don't have startability either. We have both of them ranked in the wide receiver 3 range. Obviously, Tyler Boyd is going to be the last wide receiver we do have in the rankings on the Cincinnati side. He, of course, is coming off of a bust performance last week, but with him being a receiver that does require a bit more volume to produce, yes, he fell into the end zone in week 3 against Pittsburgh, but that was his lone touchdown on the season. It also came in a game in which there was no T. Higgins. With T. Higgins back, his target market share is unlikely to remain as high as it was in games he was out, so his floor and his ceiling, they are going to be a bit lower. Regardless though, we do have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 3. T. Higgins more of a high-end wide receiver 3, somebody pushing for that wide receiver 2 type value. I wouldn't be surprised at all if T. Higgins put up 80 yards, a receiving touchdown. So for those of you out there that own Higgins, started him last week and were disappointed with the output, don't let that be a reason that you leave him on the bench this week. I think you might regret it. But moving into the next one, we have the Houston Texans on the road against the Indianapolis Colts. These are two teams that have very poor pass defenses. Despite that, the game total in this one is going to be extremely low. We're talking 43.5 points. And believe it or not, the Indianapolis Colts are 10-point favorites in this one. So if you can read between the lines, there isn't expected to be all that much production scored on the Houston side of things. So expecting any players to score a touchdown on that side of the ball, it's just an unrealistic expectation in this one. Indianapolis, though, very beatable through the air. So Brandon Cooks, a player who has scored 1 receiving touchdown this season. While I don't think he will get lucky and reach pay dirt this week, it's certainly possible, but I do see him as more of a high floor option at the receiver position. I know he himself is coming off of 2 poor performances, but those matchups were against the New England Patriots, the Buffalo Bills. On the season, the Indianapolis Colts have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, and they haven't exactly faced the stiffest competition. So Brandon Cooks, a player that we did see start off on a tear against weaker pass defenses, I would fully expect him to have a bounce back game this week. We have him ranked as a wide receiver 2, a back end one, but still somebody that has plenty of fantasy value for your lineup this week. On the other side of the ball, Michael Pittman, he's actually coming off of his first game where he actually scored a receiving touchdown. Believe it or not, it was his best fantasy performance of the entire season. He accomplished all that despite receiving the lowest targets he'd received since week 1. But as we all know with Indianapolis Colts, all the passing game does go through Pittman, so if we're trusting anybody in this passing offense at the receiver position, Michael Pittman, a player who really hasn't busted since that week 1 outing, he's the guy we're definitely going to. One thing I will say though is that I did mention Houston Texans have been a weaker pass defense, and while that is true, the level of competition that they've faced so far this season, it hasn't been all that great. So on paper, it does look like a more difficult matchup than it truly is. The only thing I would truly be concerned with though is that Houston puts the primary focus of their defense on Michael Pittman. In that case, I could definitely see them having success in limiting him. So while he does have upside in this matchup, I would be surprised if this does ultimately end up being his best fantasy day of the season. So repeating what he did last week, while unlikely, he'll more than make up for it with his floor. The only other wide receiver for Indy we're considering starting is Zach Pascal, and if what I did say does hold true and the Houston Texans do focus on Michael Pittman, Zach Pascal does have an opportunity to have a better fantasy day. We've already seen receivers like Mo Alley-Cox have 2 receiving touchdowns, so that's not to say that there isn't upside to be had outside of Michael Pittman in this passing offense. And with many of our teams being a bit thin at several positions, you could do worse than Zach Pascal this week. Keep in mind, I would only trust him as a desperation flex, but some of us out there, we are going to be forced to make tough decisions, and Zach Pascal could be a player you get off the waiver wire and insert into your lineup this week. Moving into the next one though, we have the LA LA Rams versus the New York Giants. The New York Giants are going to be home in this one, and I can't get started on the injuries. There just are so many on the New York side of things, starting with Daniel Jones, a player who's likely to actually suit up in this matchup, despite appearing to have a concussion last week. That is going to be a positive note for all the weapons in this offense. Running backs being Devontae Booker with Saquon down. That's an upgrade for him. Kadarius Toney, Sterling Shepard, the two wide receivers expected to lead this team. Both of them are well in play this week so long as Daniel Jones is the starter. I wouldn't really touch them if we have Mike Glennon starting though. I know Kadarius Toney proved to have a lot of upside in a matchup with Mike Glennon starting, but facing the LA Rams, a team that can certainly shut out wide receivers, I wouldn't expect him to have as much success. So if Mike Glennon's starting, I would temper my expectation, but if you do have to start him, Kadarius Toney's the one we want. We have him ranked as a wide receiver 3 this week. Sterling Shepard, the leading wide receiver before he went out with an injury, we have him ranked as a flex in his first game back. We're not starting any other wide receiver on the New York side of things though, so moving over to the LA Rams, and it's much simpler. As we all know, we're starting Cooper Kupp every week. Even though his last 2 performances have been a bit on the modest side compared to the explosive performances he had through the first 3 weeks, he still has yet to post a game without double-digit fantasy points in a PPR league. He hasn't scored a receiving touchdown in the past 2 weeks, so we haven't seen him hit the high end of his production, but I wouldn't be surprised for him to cure that this week against the New York Giants. So far, the New York Giants have only allowed 5 receiving touchdowns on the season, which is certainly on the lower end, but with them lacking a lot of weapons offensively, the chance that Daniel Jones may not be the starter, and even if he is, he hasn't faced a defense like the LA Rams, so time of possession is likely going to be heavily in favor of the LA Rams. Cooper Kupp, trust him as a mid-grade wide receiver 1. He certainly has the upside to compete with the best of them. As for Robert Woods though, coming off of his best performance of the season, I definitely think you should be tempering your expectations. In this positive matchup though, you can't be surprised we do have him ranked as a wide receiver 2. If he sees anything similar to the type of target market share he saw last week, he will blow that out of the water, but as a Robert Woods owner myself, I'm a bit concerned that situation is more squeaky wheel gets the oil. If that is the case, then Robert Woods could go back to his previous production, which was not even starter worthy, so just be mindful that that is within his range of outcomes. But as for Van Jefferson, a player that does have a high chance to bust, I do think he is worth bringing up in this matchup because he has put together a few solid performances, and in a game where the time of possession could be heavily favoring the LA Rams, them also having 2 premier wide receivers that are going to take up the majority of the attention of the defense, even with Robert Woods now coming off of his best performance, it's certainly possible with the defense's attention on other players that Van Jefferson does sneak by this defense with his speed, breaks away for a big play, and when starting him in the flex, that's really all you need for his start to pay off. So we do have him listed as a desperation flex. He's not anybody that I would really invest too much money into. He's more of a DraftKings play if anything, but if you are desperate, need a player off the waiver wire, this is another player you could throw into that hat. Moving into a very interesting matchup, we have the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Washington football team. Believe it or not, heading into the season, these were 2 of the scariest defenses that you were going to face. The Kansas City Chiefs last season being one of the best teams at defending opposing wide receivers, the Washington football team having one of the scariest front sevens in the entire league. Well, fast forward 6 weeks into the season, and both of these defenses have been absolutely abysmal. It's no wonder why the overall projected totals at 54 points. Kansas City 6.5 point favorites in this one, but I'm a bit surprised that the gap isn't a bit wider. Terry McLaurin, he is noted as having an injury. Curtis Samuel, if you missed it, he's potentially going back on IR, and with Logan Thomas already there, this team is certainly short of playmakers. I would expect JD McKissick to be heavily involved. The backup tight end, Ricky Seals-Jones as well, expect him to have an increased role, but with Terry McLaurin being the healthiest receiver on this team outside of players that really are unproven, if he does suit up, the upside for him in this one is absolutely enormous. So no surprise we have him ranked as a wide receiver 1. We know what type of upside he brings to the table, and as I mentioned earlier, Kansas City, they're not actually scary like they were last season at defending wide receivers, so if McLaurin does play a high amount of snaps, he doesn't get knocked out of this game or re-aggravate an injury, he very well could put in his best performance of the season. And to throw out another name for you desperate owners out there, Adam Humphries could be a name that does get involved with the injuries I mentioned earlier. So those of you in deeper leagues, and the players I did mention already leading up to this point, maybe they're off the waiver wire, this could be another name that you could potentially consider. It is a great matchup in a game with a high total. And on the Kansas City side of things, as we know, Tyreek Tyreek Hill a bona fide wide receiver one, no need in spending time on him. I think the main question that people will have on who to start would be between Mecole Hardman and potentially some of their other bench players. Mecole Hardman's coming off of his highest targeted game of the season, so expecting him to be involved in this game, I think that's a fairly reasonable expectation. When it comes to attacking this Washington defense, it comes through volume through the air at the wide receiver position. They've currently allowed the most targets on the season, and while the receptions aren't exactly the highest, they're definitely in the top 5. So Mecole Hardman being a player who received the most volume he'd seen, if that trend were to ever continue, this would be the defense to do it against. For that reason, we do have him ranked as a flex. One still ranking outside the top 40 though, so don't get it mistaken, he is still going to be a risky play, but we all know the type of upside the talent of Mecole Hardman can bring if he actually reaches the ceiling we all know he has. The next matchup we have is possibly the most interesting of the entire week. It's the Arizona Cardinals versus the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland is going to be the home favorites in this one, which may shock a lot of people because Arizona, they're currently undefeated on the season. Despite that, as mentioned, Cleveland 3.5-point home favorites, even when they're down several players. As we know, Nick Chubb's already rolled out, Jarvis Landry as well, he's on IR. This team desperate for playmakers. We saw David Njoku pop off last week, and they'll certainly have to get other names involved if they want to compete with the Arizona Cardinals offense. And since they will be competing with one of the best, if not the best offense in the league, that does mean we do have to consider the wide receivers a bit more than we would in other matchups. So Odell Beckham Jr., a player that we haven't really trusted since his first matchup, he proved us wrong immediately the game after, but even in this one though, I think you can start him as a back-end wide receiver too, just due to the desperation this team does have to fill the need at wide receiver in this one. Also Rashard Higgins, another player we have in that gross range of players that are going to be taken off the waiver wire, potentially started for those teams that own Saquon, Juju Smith-Schuster, maybe those Kenny Golladay owners as well. I know some tough decisions do have to be made, but we can't forget that Rashard Higgins is coming off of a game in which he did score a receiving touchdown. No, he's not flashy. His upside does fail in comparison to Odell Beckham, but believe it or not, in the past 2 matchups, he's scored double-digit fantasy points in both of them. So he has actually been the most productive receiver through that same span. So trusting Rashard Higgins may not be the worst decision you make in the world. Despite that though, we do have him ranked as a desperation flex. On the other side of the ball though, for Arizona, it's pretty much the same story that we've had over the past several weeks. DeAndre Hopkins, a wide receiver 2. The wide receiver 1 upside and heavy targets that he had last season, we're not really seeing like we did last year. Couple that with the injury he sustained at the early portion of the season, and he's not producing at his highest level. Regardless though, trust him as a high-end wide receiver 2 in this one. It is a tough defensive draw though, so his upside could be called into question, but if the game's close, you know the receiver they're going to be targeting heavily is DeAndre Hopkins. So in the 3rd, 4th quarter, if the game's on the line, he's going to be peppered with targets. But as for the other receivers, Rondale Moore, Christian Kirk, and AJ Green, they're nothing more than flex players, and in this one they're going to come with a bit more risk. In fact, both Christian Kirk and AJ Green were considering high-risk flex players, those desperation flex players. They're going to be in that same range as several of the other players that I mentioned as desperation flexes, but they're going to be players that are already owned on rosters. So many of you, if you're in a desperate situation, you're not going to need to consider them. If you do own Christian Kirk or AJ Green, this is likely not the matchup you'll want to trust them in. It's not really the type of matchup I would want to trust Rondale Moore in either, but with him coming off of another productive outing, him proving to be a receiver that can get it done on a low target volume, if there was a player to break free, get one play that gets behind the defense, he would likely be that option. So for that, he is going to be ranked the highest, and while still in that flex range, he would be the one that has my most trust. If this were a better matchup with Max Williams on IR, I would think all of these players do have much more upside, but with this being against Cleveland, if I have other options, I'm looking in a different direction because these players bust in much better matchups already. Moving into a divisional game, the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Denver Broncos. These are two teams that started off red hot but have cooled down since, and with this being a divisional matchup, it could go many different directions, but one thing that we do know is that this game has a very low total. One positive thing though on the Denver side of the ball is that they're missing a ton of receivers. The target market share in this offense is extremely consolidated. Tim Patrick, he's a wide receiver 30 on the season. Courtland Sutton, he's a top 24 option virtually each and every week in this matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders defense, so it shouldn't be too surprising to see that we have them ranked exactly where they've been producing all season. Courtland Sutton, the wide receiver 2 this week. Tim Patrick, more of a wide receiver 3. I would consider both of them safe in this matchup. Players that I don't feel so confident, though, are on the other side of the ball for the Las Vegas Raiders. Henry Ruggs, Hunter Renfrow, Bryan Edwards, the one player out of the 3 that's definitely fallen a bit behind from the other 2. As we all know, though, Hunter Renfrow is going to be more of that high volume player. He's performed much more consistently when compared to the other 2 receivers, but that has come at the expense of upside. When the game's on the line, though, and they have to move the chains, he's consistently the option they look to, so expect him once again to be peppered with targets. How much upside those targets will bring, though, that's the real question we have to ask ourselves. With this matchup being against Denver, though, we do have to temper our expectations, so even expecting him to produce as he has over the past few weeks, it's a tall order. The same does go for Henry Ruggs, but with him only needing one play to break through, I'm much more willing to invest in the upside of him. So if I do have a choice between starting either of those wide receivers, Hunter Renfrow or Henry Ruggs, I'm definitely siding with the upside of Ruggs. Bryan Edwards, on the other hand, a player who has disappointed many of us over the past few weeks. At this point, he can be dropped. We should not be considering starting him, and from this point forward, I'm unlikely to include him in the wide receiver breakdowns. Moving into the next matchup, though, we have the New England Patriots versus the Dallas Cowboys. I was very interested to see this game having one of the higher totals at 50.5 points. We obviously can't be surprised in a game with the Dallas Cowboys. Their offense can compete with the best of them, but as we know with New England, a team short of playmakers, I was surprised to see the total so high with the spread only being a mere 3.5 points. What that does tell us, though, is that we can trust the wide receivers in this matchup. So Jacoby Myers, the high floor option we've seen so far this season, he will once again be a high floor option in this one, but in addition to that, he's going to have even more upside. If the Patriots are going to match their projected team total, Jacoby Myers is going to be a large part of that, and while he may break the record for most receptions without a receiving touchdown, having a consistent player like that producing in your flex spot is still extremely valuable. And since I'm going to continue the trend of including other wide receivers that we normally wouldn't start in other matchups, I think this matchup is one you should specifically target. 2 names I'll throw out there: Nelson Agholor, even Kendrick Bourne are 2 players you could theoretically start in this one, and you may not be disappointed in the production you get from them. Obviously, Nelson Agholor is going to be the safer option of the 2, but with the Patriots needing to score plenty of points to keep up with Dallas not being a strong defense in themselves, you could definitely do worse than either of these 2 wide receivers. So both of those players are going to be listed as desperation flexes, so once again, names to throw in the hat. But on the other side of the ball, CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, one thing to keep in mind if you do own either of those 2 players is you do have to temper expectations in this one. This is, of course, the New England Patriots pass defense. While not as great as it has been last year, it's still not one that you do want to mess with. For that reason, the regular wide receiver 1 ranking we do have for both of these players, that has been reduced to a back-end wide receiver 2 ranking. The splits between both of these players being extremely small, we do have only 1 player separating each of them, so while if you do own them, you're likely going to start them, as mentioned, temper expectations in this one. We've seen them disappoint in better matchups, so this one against the New England Patriots, would we really be all that surprised if one of them did end up putting up a dud? Moving into the next matchup, we have a really odd one. It's the Seattle Seahawks without Russell Wilson versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Steelers having just lost Juju, and as mentioned, Seattle having just lost Russell Wilson, also Chris Carson. Neither of these offenses are going to be coming into this game at full strength, but it's easy to see that Pittsburgh has a heavy advantage offensively. Time of possession should heavily favor them. So the 2 wide receivers that do remain, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, their floors in this one are going to be absolutely enormous. When it comes to floor and Chase Claypool, those are 2 words that don't typically go hand in hand, but I think in this one you can actually trust him. Both players obviously have wide receiver 1 upside. Deontay, arguably one of the safest wide receivers in the league this week, and that's something we definitely can't say about the receivers on the other side of the ball. It's expected that Geno Smith is going to be the starter, and if Geno Smith is starting, it's unclear exactly what type of output we're going to get from either of these 2 receivers. If you do own them, you just kind of have to suck it up, start them. The ranking we do have for them, while it is a projection, I wouldn't be shocked if Tyler Lockett exceeds expectation at the expense of DK, or DK exceeds expectations at the expense of Tyler Lockett, and I wouldn't even be surprised if that flips completely backwards the next week, because we just honestly don't know how this offense is going to operate without their top running back and Russell Wilson leading the helm. The final matchup we have, the Monday night matchup, Buffalo Bills versus the Tennessee Titans. This game does remind me a bit of the Dallas and New England game. You have one defense that's extremely strong against one team that does get most of their work done offensively. Tennessee, while not as good offensively as Dallas, it's definitely the strength over their defense, and with having AJ Brown back and Julio Jones now in the lineup, it is going to give them a bit more upside, but they're facing a brick wall this week in the Buffalo Bills, the absolute best team at mitigating fantasy points to wide receivers. So while both players do need a bounce back game, that being Julio Jones and AJ Brown, considering that both players have busted in better matchups and neither one of them has actually fully produced so far this season, we can't be all that surprised if yet again against this tough defense they both bust. Regardless though, AJ Brown, we have him as a wide receiver 3 in this one. Julio Jones, more of a flex this week. On the other side of the ball though, you have immense upside at the wide receiver positions, mainly Stephon Diggs. He is a high-end wide receiver 1 in this matchup, but Emmanuel Sanders, a player who has had 4 receiving touchdowns in the past 3 games, he once again will have a ton of upside as well. We do have him ranked as a wide receiver 3 though. That's because we do have Cole Beasley projected to be more involved this week. Beasley has been a player that's been a bit phased out, and as we know, Dawson Knox being featured in the red zone, Cole Beasley has had a hard time really carving out a role, but if there was a game for him to have a bounce back, this would definitely be the one. So I think the gap between Sanders and Beasley is a bit shorter and smaller than people give it credit for. Regardless though, if you own either of these 3 receivers, you should likely get him into the lineup this week. The Tennessee Titans have allowed the most fantasy points to wide receivers on the back of heavy yardage and heavy volume. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.